So I'll start with a little story, which is around 1970, 71, 72. I was going around Rome, central Italy, looking for working class folk songs. And I wasn't looking for those songs because I was a folklorist, not because I was a historian, not even because I was beginning to become a professor of literature. I was doing this because I was a political activist. And I was looking for the sources of working class culture in our country. So I ended up in, so I didn't know, I had never heard of oral history either. So I ended up in this town, Terni, which I had grown up in, but I knew nothing about. And people would sing songs about the resistance, about unions, about the struggles. And then they would, because I was not an academically trained folklorist, I didn't know that all that I should be interested in was the music. I also listened to the stories that they told with the music. And after a while I realized that all the stories, that most of the stories that I kept hearing were wrong. They had the facts all wrong. Now, fortunately, I was not a historian. Had I been a historian, I would have said, see, you can't trust oral sources. I was training myself to become a professor of literature, and in literature, we don't throw away a good story just because it isn't true. And the question we ask is, what does it mean? Where does it come from? What is the meaning? So, what was I doing there? Because why was I looking for these songs? And this has to do a lot with Indira's point about how institutions think. How did Italian institutions in the fields of arts, literature, history think after World War II, after the collapse of fascism? Remember, Italy had the fortune and misfortune of being the center of the Renaissance. That is one of the world centers of high culture, which means that the dominant theory by the liberal institutions was the theory, was Benedetto Croce's theory of the ethical, political nature of history, which boils down to this. History is made by the elites. The rest of us human beings are not in it, are just not part of that. This, also remember, fascism had rejected or made it impossible to develop such a thing as ethnography, sociology, the social sciences. Under fascism, all you had was philosophy and philosophical theory. So Benedetto Croce's theory was the official institutional ideology of the academy, of Italian intellectuals. It was so powerful that even the Communist Party bought into it. And so that the history of the workers in Italy was not the history of the workers, but it was the history of the political representations of the workers. That is, the history of the Communist Socialist parties or the unions. And the history of the Communist Socialist Party and the unions was not the history of the Communist Socialist Party and the unions, but it was the history of the leaders of the Communist Socialist Party and the unions. So, and this was the state of the art around 1949, 1950. Then a few things started happening. The poor, illiterate, out of history peasants in southern Italy, Calabria, Puglia, even Lazio, rebelled against the big landholding estates and started occupying the lands. Meanwhile, in Africa, Asia, India, the masses of the colonized people began to throw away the colonizers and rebel against those. And one of the most intelligent students of Benedetto Croce, Ernesto De Martino, who was a philosopher, who was becoming an ethnologist, and was also the secretary of the Socialist Party in Puglia. Ernesto De Martino hailed these events, the occupation of the lands, the anti-colonial rebellions, as the eruption of the masses into history. Suddenly, history is being invaded by southern peasants, by African colonized subjects, by Indian colonized subjects, but Benedetto Croce recognized that India was part of history, and maybe not all the Indians, but some of them. And this was a major turning point in our recognition, in the recognition that there was such a thing as a history and culture of the non-hegemonic classes. We use this term non-hegemonic from Gramsci's theory of hegemony. Gramsci's theory of hegemony is that the power of the ruling classes comes from violence, but also from persuasion, and the combination of violence and persuasion he calls hegemony. So those who are not part of this hegemonic power, the peasants, the workers, the colonized, were suddenly breaking into history, or perhaps we were just now beginning to realize that it had always been there, and except we didn't know. And this generated some early ethnography in the culture of the peasants of the Italian South. Ernesto De Martino's work on death rituals, on healing, on the therapeutic use of music, or Rocco Scotellaro. Rocco Scotellaro, was a poet. He was a socialist mayor of a small town in central Italy, and he went to jail for leading the occupation of the land. And he wrote the first collection of life stories of southern peasants in 1954. Meanwhile, in the north, people like Gianni Bosio, who later became my mentor, were trying to apply this approach not just to what was happening in the rural South, but also to what was happening in the industrial North. And they came up with the question: how do we document not the history of the labor movement, but the history of the working people, their daily lives, what they do outside or against their political representations. Remember, we're talking about the 50s. At least 70% of industrial workers voted for the Communist Party in Italy. So this was not just an ideological thing. It was a huge rank and file mass movement. So how do we document their lives? There was a quote from Karl Marx that everybody quoted. They cannot represent themselves. They must be represented. Gianni Bosio was a Marxist of sort, but he didn't believe that Karl Marx was God. So he said maybe they do represent themselves, and so we need to look for where do they represent themselves. How do they represent themselves? And And this was a time when an Italian ethnomusicologist, Diego Carpitella, and a great American ethnomusicologist, Alan Lomax, the one who discovered Woody Guthrie and who is responsible for Muddy Waters and all sorts. He came to Italy because he was a political exile from the United States, and they rediscovered Italian folk music. And so Gianni Bosio and others said, maybe this is where a lot of the self-representation of working people is being sedimented. So that the Italian folk music revival did not come from the folklorists, but came mainly from radical historians. Folk songs were a source of historical knowledge about the working classes. And of course, Gianni Bosio also wrote the first tentative essays on oral history, on what he called the use of oral sources in historiography. And he has a major essay, very famous among the very few people who know about it. And it's called In Praise of the Tape Recorder. Because what he says is, thanks to the tape recorder, we can now do with the oral culture, with the culture of working people who have been excluded not from history, but from self-representation in the historical archives, we can do the same critical work that we have been able to do with the written record. We can now, because orality just slips through your finger, you can hold it down. So you can't do critical work unless you have a way of stopping it. And that's what the tape recorder does. You can now analyze an oral performance much as you can analyze a written text, which means you can recognize the aesthetics, the implications, the philosophy, the life view in oral discourse, and recognize the power of its culture. The other thing that Bosio had in mind was, of course, we do not take this at face value. We don't believe that there is no need for intellectuals anymore. Rather, however, as opposed to the dominant theory in the left, which was the task of the intellectuals is to bring culture to the masses, what he said, our task is to learn the culture of the masses, elaborate it with our intellectual, scientific tools, and give it back and bring it back. So rather than the organic intellectual, as described in Gramsci, the intellectual who sides with the working class, he talked about the upside-down intellectual, the intellectual who doesn't just teach, but learns from the people before he goes back to teach to them. So this was the beginning of this unique combination of folk music revival, which also meant, Gianni Bosio created the first, most important oral archive in Europe, folk music and oral history together, and also promoted a number of events, concerts, festivals in which the music was being brought back, and of course it all sounded very suspicious to the liberal Catholic conservative academy, even and to the official socialist, communist left intellectuals. And the main and also to the lazy historians who prefer to sit in the archive rather than get out and walk and listen to. And of course, there were a number of questions that were being raised. Number one, are you really going to believe what old people tell you? It's unreliable. Number two, how are you going to generalize? Okay, somebody tells you something. So how do you generalize from it? And of course, some of the immediate responses were defensive. A lot of what we hear can be cross-checked with other sources, with the art. One thing you learn from doing oral history is digression and a love of anecdotes. So I'll digress and tell you a little anecdote about cross-checking. 1979, I'm doing interviews in Terni, this industrial town, and I'm literally interviewing people off the streets. And we're in an old working class neighborhood, and this man says, "Oh, this place was wonderful. It was a real family. It was just like a family. We were living. They were next to the town hospital. So at night we would all bring our stools down, sit down in the streets, talk, drink a glass of wine, bite of cheese, and after a while, knives would come out." Because you're just like a family, And there's this great story, he says, where this man, he was a shoemaker, and he was ugly. And this other guy kept making fun of him, till he got so mad he took his awl and he opened him up. His wife came down with a basket, gathered his innards in the basket, carried him to the hospital, they sewed him up, and he lived happily ever after. So this is a great story, told in 1979. I found a newspaper clipping of 1907 that describes the story exactly as it was told by my interviewee. So a lot of the stories you hear, you can verify. And that was the first immediate answer. The second answer was, what are the sources of the archival papers that you rely so much on? The main story that I was interested in Terni was a story that some of you may have read about, which was about the killing of this young man in a protest against the NATO alliance. So one of the things I did, of course, was I went to the archives, because you don't do oral, that was one thing. You can't do oral history only with you can't do history only with oral sources. Number one, none of us, as Indira just showed, does it only with oral sources. And in fact, our typical response was, and can you do history only with written sources? But so I went to the archives. And here was the judicial proceedings for this event. The first sentence on the first page of this huge pile of papers said, "From oral information we received, it appears that," that is, the whole construction of the written archives begins with oral information. A lot of what judicial records, of course, a trial is carried out orally. There are transcripts of what's told. Parliamentary records, also newspaper interviews. Forget about it. So So that was the other defensive response. What happened in the 70s was what has been called a sort of Copernican revolution, because some of us began to change the theme, change the paradigm. Like one of the parts of humankind that was underrepresented in the official record. It was not just workers, it was women. And the new field of women's history, of course, tied in immediately with oral history. And a historian like Luisa Passerini, who came from the feminist movement, who was also a trained historian and had worked on colonial and anti-colonial narratives, immediately perceived that what was really important in the stories was yes, indeed, the factual content, but much more than that, the subjectivity in it. That is, the relationship between the person that told the story and the facts. And I was getting at the same conclusion from another point of view, which was approaching the narrative, approaching the history, not just in terms of the explicit factual information, but also in terms of the narrative structure of what was implied in the narrative form. That is, in other words, we were thinking of memory, number one, not just as a place where information is stored and then lost. But we're thinking of memory as a place where information is elaborated, not as the memory of the computer, but as the computer. With memory, we were thinking of memory as a constant reworking of the meaning of the past for the present. Because one thing we immediately recognized, well, not immediately, but we recognized, was, okay, you do, in 2017, you do an interview about, say, 1989 here. It's a document about 1989, but it's a document of 2017. Because what you have is a triangulation between the event, the time of the event, and the time of the telling, and all the time in between. What has happened to the meaning of 1989 between then and today for this person and for the social group to which this person belongs, for its name. See, so we were thinking also, one other question that was raised, because you should always listen to criticism, was the use of the interview. Of course, you interfere. It's not, what you get is not genuine. It's a response to your presence. And therefore, by carrying out the interview, you interfere with the authenticity of the story. You know, you had this famous sociological theory, which fortunately has gone out of the window, which was the perfect sociologist, the perfect ethnologist is a fly on the wall. That is, he doesn't get involved. He's just there and he watches. My reaction to this was, if I see a fly on the wall, my instinct is to squash it. And number two, the fact that there's a fly on the wall tells you a lot about the air in the room. So, a fly on the wall is not invisible. So we turned this around, and we said, no, this is one of the great assets, because what we get is not the unadulterated authenticity that does not exist, in fact, because a story does not exist unless it's told to someone. So, but what we get is a testimony of the relationship between between a narrator and a historian, and a relationship between different layers of culture, between different agendas. There was a wonderful book by this American literary critic, a specialist in Native American literature, Arnold Krupat. And he talks about how all we have of the narratives of Native Americans in the 18th, 19th century comes to us through the mediation of white people who interviewed them. And the same applies to a lot of the slave narratives. So the interview is not so much a contamination of the purity, but rather a result of a personal relationship. So from the idea of the objective, neutral, solid fact, we were moving on with it. We were not abandoning facts. I was very happy when I could prove that knifing in 1907 had really happened. But we were expanding to include relationships, memory as relationship, a relationship between the time of the event and the time of the telling, a relationship between the narrator and the interviewer, and of course, then a relationship between the oral performance, the sound document, and the written book that we produce. And all these things are relationships. So what happened with the story I was starting out with? Basically, this was about the killing of this young man, 1949, killed by the police in the middle of the boulevard outside the factory gates, as the workers were marching out of the gates, probably to go to a demonstration. In 1949, say 75% of the people I talked to claimed that he had been killed in 1953. So had it just been one person, said, okay, the faulty memory of an old man. You don't really look to oral sources for dates, okay? Those, the written source, the written archives are more reliable in terms of dates. But when everybody makes the same mistake, then there must be something cultural going on. So my first response to this was, we remember history in terms of a sequence of discrete events. We write history in terms of a sequence of discrete events. The historiography is linear and chronological. Memory is not linear. Memory is synchronic. We remember all the past at the same time. I mean, just right now, test yourselves. You're remembering when you were 6 years old, what you did yesterday, some other event that took place 3 months ago, and you're all remembering them all right now. So memory is synchronic, which means that in memory things connections are not made by sequence, but by association. So this means that there must be some kind of connection in terms of meaning between the event between 1949 and 1953. And one thing was that if you read the history books, there was a strike in 1949, there was another strike in 1950, there was an election in 1951, there was an accident in a factory in 1952, there was another strike in This is how the history book tells the story. The way the workers told the story was, after the war, I remember the typical question, and what happened after the war? And the answer, this woman, another war. What they remember is not a sequence of events, but a state of mind that encompasses a number of events. They don't remember battles. They remember a war that lasted a number of years. And the same applies to the coal miners in Kentucky in the book that's been circulating. There was a famous battle between coal miners and the police and the National Guard in 1931. Coal miners and the private police of the coal owners. In 1931, there was another one in 37, there was one in 39, there was one in 41. So you ask, well, what was the 30s like? What happened in the 30s? Oh, it was a war. And when you remember a war, you remember continuity, a state of mind, and a state of relationships rather than individual events. So that was one thing. The other thing was, all right, but what is the relationship between 1949 and 1953? And I remember, and what happened in 1953? What was the context? In 1949, I remember this very well, this young man was killed. And I remember asking one of those who remember the date correctly, okay, he gets killed. So what did you do? And he goes, nothing. 35 years later, he was still angry. The day, I just hurt my hand. Well, he didn't hurt his, he was a steel worker. He was still angry that they had not done anything about the murder of their comrade. In 1953, the steelworks, they were owned by the state at that time, fired 3,000 workers, heads of families. And this was a town where, the town lived from the factory. You fire 3,000 workers, it's disaster for everyone. So there was a rebellion. There were barricades. For 3 days they fought back. And everybody, and most people, placed the death of this young man, Luigi Trastulli, in 1953. In 1953. Why? Well, for one thing, you could tell that when they took to the barricades in 1953, they had him in mind. I grew up in Terni, in a factory village, and mine was the only non-working class family there. But my closest friend he went to work in the factory later on. My closest friend, I traced him years back. He was doing some very advanced technical work in Uzbekistan. So I wrote to him, I'm trying to investigate this story. And he wrote back and he said, I remember that my first political emotions came when I was 12, and my father kept talking to me about the killing of Luigi Trastulli. Now, my closest friend was born in 1941. He was 12 in 1953. And my next door neighbor, who was a little bit older, he went to work in the factory in 1953. And he said, when we started work there, the old workers kept telling you, look, if you have a job here, if you have some rights, you owe it to this man who got killed for you. So 1953, Luigi Trastulli was part of the initiation of the young working class. So they went to when they went to the barricades, they went to the barricades with him in mind. Also because, and here's where literature helps you. There's a novel by William Faulkner called Light in August. And in Light in August, somebody fires a shot during the Civil War in 1865. Somebody shoots back in 1929. So what had happened there was that the working class of Terni had been slapped in the face and humiliated in 1949. Remember, they had been the backbone of the anti-fascist, of the resistance movement. They had saved the factory. They had won the local. They thought they owned the place, and one of them can be killed and they can do nothing about it. It's a humiliation. So they were humiliated they were slapped in the face in 1949, and they slapped back in 1953. In 1953, they didn't get their jobs back, but they got their pride back. Because, of course, if you have a martyr, well, a martyr can't be killed accidentally because one policeman panics and he shoots into the crowd, because it was mainly accidental. No, a martyr must die in the right context and for the appropriate cause. This is Max Weber, incidentally. And the right context and the appropriate cause is when the whole town is in rebellion. Also, see the change of meaning of the past in the present. 1949, communists, socialists, unions were all against the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance. 1977, 78, 79, when I was doing these interviews, the Communist Party Secretary Enrico Berlinguer was claiming that the NATO alliance was a protection for our country. So how are you going to explain in 1979 that somebody got himself killed in 1949 fighting against something which is now the official party line is our protection? You can't. And also, what is really important to you? NATO or your job or your livelihood? So you put him back into that context. And he becomes a martyr. And the ways in which the killing is described, I won't go into the details but some of them make it look like a crucifixion. Others make it look like the shooting of partisans by the Nazis, because it's a symbolic martyr. And I'll just give you one detail about this and tell you a little story and stuff. One narrator says, he places the event in a different part of town. And he says he was standing on the roof of this building on the main square, the old post office building. And the police shot him, and we saw him fall from the roof of the post office building, and he fell down. Of course, it didn't happen this way in 1949. It happened this way in 1919. In 1919, during another demonstration, the police fired into the crowds, killed 5 people, and one of them was a young man who was standing on top of the post office building on the main square, and he fell down. So for some reason, that memory had seeped into the imagination about this killing. So this tells you how complicated that rich memory is. One little anecdote about how institutions think. 2004, four oral historians, one from Australia, Al Thompson, one from Germany, one from the United States, Mary Marshall Clark, and one from Italy, I, get invited to Brazil. We're invited to Brazil, and we're given an opportunity which is very rare. Each of us gets a whole morning to talk about what we do and what. So I go first, and I talk about how oral history is really an art of the individual, because there's no such thing as collective memory. Memory is always personal. It's always it's social in that our personal memories are shaped by our position in society and all, but basically it's an art of the individual. One of the reasons why I'm fascinated by oral history is there are no two people alike. They're all different. Mary Marshall Clark, my dear friend and colleague, had not arrived and had not heard me. So she goes on the next day and she says, what really fascinates me is in oral history is because it's an art of the collective. Okay. Everybody laughs and she doesn't know why. You know? so we discussed it, and I said, of course you're right, Mary Mark. She said, no, you were right. And we were so convinced that we did the same thing, but exchanging roles. We did this in São Paulo. Then we went to Rio, and I talked about oral history as an art of the collective, as she talked about, because what we recognized was that, well, why do I insist so much about the individual? Because, of course, I was raised in a culture, much has changed, in which the dominant, the main lines of thinking were Catholicism, which is based on solidarity, the community, and socialism. Both are philosophies of the social, of the collective. So by stressing the individual, I was going against the grain of my culture. On the other hand, Mary Marshall comes from a culture where, this Anglo-Saxon culture where Mrs. Thatcher once famously said, there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals. And a culture where they tell you America stands for the individual. So by stressing the social, the collective, she is going against the grain of her own culture. So ultimately, what does it boil down to? That what we're doing, maybe it's not just oral history, maybe it's the task of the intellectual. But anyway, that's where we come from, is to go against the grain of how our institutions think, and generate on the one hand independent critical thinking by conscious citizens, and on the other hand a sense of collectivity, of solidarity, of society, which is very much under attack at the present time. I always go on too long. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Alessandro, for your participation. So we have just two questions, and then we change to general. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating, and I would say it was a great story.
Thank you.
In the best sense.
See, it's fun because you hear all these great stories.
I was wondering, especially when you were picturing those early days of oral history in Italy, just after the war, what was the connection between this movement, intellectual milieu, and Italian neorealism? Because you really made me think of that.
That's a very good point. Yes, it's a very good point. Neorealism, in a way, was part of the same discovery that the stories that needed to be told were those of common people, and bicycle thieves and things like that. So it's part of the same general ethos, which is partly a consequence of, on the one hand, of the rebellion against fascism. When fascist cinema was called the cinema of the white telephones, because white telephone was a status symbol, and all the protagonists of fascist films were the elites. And also, I must say, of the, at the time, crucial democratic role, it might sound like an oxymoron, but historical, the crucial democratic role of the Communist Party, which accompanied these people into an awareness that not only they were in history, they were the cutting edge of history. See? So then there were a few other things, but this was a crucial moment, and as opposed, I would say, to the Catholic Party that was in power in Italy, controlled media, actually had some of the leading scriptwriters of the Italian Neorealism arrested for telling stories like this. But the sense was, yes, you talk about the humble, but precisely because they're humble. So we sort of have a sense of paternalistic pity towards them, whereas the people in neorealist cinema and of course in the early radical movements in Italy, they were not humble. They were not humble. They were proud. I think you're right.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I just wanted to clarify one thing. You mentioned that they reimagined the person from 1949 to 1953, but I kind of didn't catch whether they did it consciously.
No, they didn't consciously.
So it was like the movement ended and later on they all followed it like that? Or did they...
Well, of course, if you ask them in 1954, they would have known. But I was interviewing them from 1978, actually from 1972 to 1985. And by then, they had created a synthesis of meaning and memory. One thing, of course, I had this ethical question. Do I tell them they've got it wrong? And I decided that it's much more respectful to tell them. Possibly, the best methodology in oral history interview is respect and good manners. But so you'd say, "Are you sure? Are you sure it was 53? Because I just saw a plaque by the factory gate that says 49." And one thing you can figure, I found out was they don't really care about dates. They didn't care about dates. So, of course, they made very interesting adjustments, like, there were actually two sets of layoffs, one in 49, one in 53, this happened in between, things like that. But ultimately, most of the people to whom I pointed this out, they were not impressed, because they were not after the exact date. They were after the exact meaning, and the exact meaning is the killing of this young man is a symbol of class relationships and relationships between citizens and the state at that time in the 50s. And also, it's a symbol of a loss and recovery of pride and identity. So who cares ultimately whether it was 49 or 53? What it means is this. So yes, they didn't do it consciously. It was just a synthesis that created meaning.